Cleveland, Ohio, October 20th, 1944. The city pulsed with industry. Trains rattled through the yards, ship horns echoed from the Cuyahoga River, and factory chimneys painted the sky in drifting trails of smoke. It was a city of noise and ambition, a heartbeat of America's wartime engine. Every hammer strike and siren note spoke of progress, of men working for victory far across the ocean. On the east side, the afternoon sun glowed faintly through haze. Streets were alive with movement, children skipping stones, mothers carrying baskets, mechanics wiping grease from their hands as shifts changed. Along East 61st Street stood the East Ohio Gas Company plant, surrounded by steel fences and glinting storage tanks that reflected the light like mirrors. Few people paid attention to it. It was part of the neighborhood skyline, as familiar as the church steeple or the corner store. Inside those tanks rested a new wonder of science, liquefied natural gas, a technology fresh from research labs and now fueling Cleveland's booming economy. For great silver cylinders towered over the houses, silent giants containing millions of cubic feet of energy cooled to hundreds of degrees below zero. They were the pride of modern engineering, until one began to whisper. A faint hiss escaped from tank number 4. The sound was thin, almost delicate, lost beneath the hum of engines and the chatter of the streets. From a small fracture near its base, an invisible cloud began to spill out. It crept low along the ground, invisible, odorless, and deadly. The vapor slipped through the plant's gates, curling around fences, finding open drains and cracks in the pavement. Beneath the feet of Cleveland citizens, it entered the city's lungs, the underground source. At 2:40 p.m., a tremor rippled through the neighborhood. A manhole cover rattled. Then, in an instant, the ground erupted. A tower of flame shot into the sky, lifting iron plates like leaves in a storm. The explosion tore through the streets, shattering windows, igniting cars, and setting homes ablaze. The noise was so violent it was felt miles away. Within seconds, panic consumed the east side. Fire roared down alleys, consuming everything it touched. People ran without direction, chased by heat so intense it peeled paint from walls. Power lines snapped and fell, hissing against the pavement. Entire houses vanished in bursts of orange light. The first tank ruptured, sending a shockwave through the plant. Workers vanished in a flash, their silhouettes lost in the blaze. Then the second tank followed, ripping apart with a scream of metal. The explosion rolled outward like thunder trapped on earth, flattening fences, overturning trucks, and turning daylight to smoke. Within 10 minutes, Cleveland's east side was gone. The city's pride had become its punishment. Streets that once carried workers to the factories now led only to fire. The air shimmered red and black, filled with sparks that drifted like snow. No enemy planes had come. No bomb had fallen. The disaster was born from within, a single leak, a single spark, and a city undone by its own creation. In the early 1940s, the East Ohio Gas Company stood at the forefront of American innovation. The war had transformed Cleveland into a city that never slept. Every factory, every rail line, every shipyard demanded energy. Coal alone could no longer sustain the hunger of an industrial machine running 24 hours a day. The company's engineers promised a solution, liquefied natural gas, or LNG, a new marvel that could store massive quantities of fuel in a fraction of the space. It was progress compressed into metal. The company constructed its pride, 4 immense cylindrical tanks that gleamed like polished silver in the afternoon sun. They towered over the east side neighborhood of St. Clair Avenue, surrounded by small brick houses, a church, and the rhythmic noise of everyday life. Each tank could hold millions of cubic feet of natural gas chilled to -260 degrees Fahrenheit. At that temperature, gas became liquid, dense, and efficient, ready to be vaporized again for homes and industries across the region. The design was bold, experimental, and entirely above ground, an engineering decision that placed innovation within sight of people's backyards. The plant was celebrated in trade journals as a triumph of modern science. Local newspapers hailed it as the future of energy. School groups toured its grounds, marveling at the massive pipes and gleaming valves. Engineers walked with confidence, knowing the plant's steel walls were thicker than any tank built before. But time and stress play their own games with metal, and in one of those walls, the seed of catastrophe was already forming. Friday, October 20th, 1944, began with still skies and mild autumn air. Workers arrived at the plant as usual. The hum of compressors filled the morning, and delivery trucks rumbled along East 61st Street. In the nearby streets, life carried on as normal. Men heading to factories, children walking home from school, families preparing dinner. No one paid attention to the faint vibration coming from tank number 4, the newest and largest of the 4 giants. Inside the tank, something was changing. The steel plates, constantly expanding and contracting under extreme temperatures, had developed a microscopic crack near the base seam. It was invisible to the naked eye but deep enough to release a steady stream of gas vapor. The pressure inside the tank was immense. Once the seal gave way, the vapor escaped silently, rolling outward across the concrete foundation. Unlike smoke or steam, liquefied gas did not rise. It moved low, crawling like fog. Invisible and heavier than air, it crept across the plant grounds, curling beneath fences and flowing into the gutters outside the property. The streets were dry, and the saw grates were open. The vapor found its path. It slipped underground, merging with the city's vast network of storm drains, a labyrinth running beneath homes, shops, and schools. At 2:30 p.m., the first signs of trouble appeared. A worker noticed a strange shimmer near the base of Tank 4. Another mentioned smelling something sweet, though few took notice. They assumed it was routine maintenance, a minor leak, perhaps. No one realized that beneath them, the gas was already spreading for several city blocks. 10 minutes later, the temperature around the tank shifted slightly. Static electricity built along the metal surfaces, and somewhere, in the unseen dark of a saw line, a single spark ignited the gas-air mixture. At 2:40 p.m., a thunderous boom shattered the calm. Manhole covers shot into the sky, some landing blocks away. Streets buckled as pressure ripped through the underground tunnels. Fire erupted from the saws, bursting through grates and tearing open the pavement. Witnesses said the flames seemed to come from nowhere, exploding upward like orange pillars. Cars parked along the curb were instantly engulfed. Windows blew out across entire rows of houses. Inside the plant, chaos broke out. Alarms rang as workers ran toward the control room. Some tried to shut valves, others rushed to alert the fire brigade. The radio lines were jammed, and the noise was deafening. Flames raced across the ground, feeding on every pocket of gas. Within minutes, the entire tank farm was surrounded by a sea of fire. Cleveland's fire department responded immediately. Engines from across the city roared toward the east side, sirens slicing through smoke. The first crews arrived to find walls of flame higher than the rooftops. Heat blasted from the site like the exhaust of a furnace. Firemen advanced with hoses, but the water turned to steam before reaching the source. The fire was not wood or oil, it was gas, burning faster than it could be contained. Then came the second explosion. Tank number 2 ruptured, throwing shards of steel hundreds of feet. The blast knocked firefighters off their feet and sent debris raining across nearby streets. One of the plant's buildings collapsed in seconds, trapping workers inside. Gas pipelines feeding into the plant burst open, adding new rivers of flame. Residents blocks away were caught in the confusion. Some ran into the streets, shielding their faces from the heat. Others fled toward the lake, thinking bombs were falling. The sky had turned dark, but the horizon glowed with an orange light that could be seen from miles away. Smoke rolled across the city, thick enough to block the sun. The air smelled of metal, ash, and fear. By 3 p.m., the fire had expanded across several city blocks. Entire sections of pavement were on fire as gas continued to escape through underground mains. Houses collapsed into smoldering ruins. Telephone poles bent under the heat, their wires sparking as they fell. Water mains burst from the pressure, sending geysers into the flames. Every sound merged into one unending roar, the hiss of burning gas, the groan of collapsing metal, the cries of people running for their lives. Firefighters tried to establish a perimeter, but the heat drove them back. The plant's tanks, once symbols of modern power, were now glowing red, their surfaces warping. Engineers watching from a distance knew what would come next. The remaining tanks could detonate at any moment. Evacuation orders went out across the east side, though few could hear them above the Inferno. The city that had once celebrated these tanks as the pinnacle of progress now watched in disbelief as they became instruments of devastation. From a distance, the plant looked like a volcano erupting in the heart of Cleveland. Flames reached hundreds of feet into the air, painting the clouds with fire. As evening approached, the blaze continued unchecked. Fire crews could do little but protect the outer edges, saving what few buildings remained beyond the immediate blast zone. The plant itself was doomed, its walls collapsing inward as molten steel dripped into pools of fire. What began as a whisper of escaping gas had become one of the deadliest industrial disasters in American history. In less than half an hour, innovation had turned against its creators. Beneath the smoke and ruin, the city's foundations trembled, reminders of how fragile progress can be when safety is forgotten. The East Ohio Gas Company's masterpiece had become its own executioner, and Cleveland would never be the same again. Inside the East Ohio Gas Company plant, the air had turned thick with panic. Engineers ran between valves, shouting over the hiss of escaping gas. One man pulled at a wheel, his gloves slipping on metal slick with condensation. Another sprinted toward the alarm box, desperate to sound the warning before the fire reached the tanks. Their voices were swallowed by the growing roar outside. In seconds, visibility vanished behind a curtain of smoke. When the first tank ruptured, the force threw them off their feet. The control room windows shattered inward, filling the air with shards of glass and flame. None of the men inside would ever make it out. Beyond the factory fence, the neighborhood continued in its ordinary rhythm. Housewives pegged sheets onto backyard lines, unaware that a wall of fire was crawling beneath their feet. The ground trembled faintly, but they mistook it for a passing truck. Children played on porches, rolling marbles along the wooden steps, laughing as the glass balls clicked and bounced. For a few more seconds, life remained innocent, unknowing. Then, without warning, the street outside buckled, and a burst of orange flame shot into the sky. The explosion hit like thunder at point-blank range. Windows shattered across the block. A delivery truck disintegrated in the street, its driver consumed before he could open the door. Fire erupted from saw grates, shooting upward in narrow, blinding columns. A woman screamed as her clothes caught fire from the blast of heat. Another clutched her baby and ran barefoot through glass, her white apron already blackened. What had been a quiet Friday afternoon was now a battlefield. The first fire engines arrived within minutes, sirens wailing through the chaos. Cleveland's firefighters, men hardened by years of factory blazes and warehouse accidents, had never seen anything like it. The heat struck them even before they stepped out of their trucks. It was the kind of fire that moved on its own, living, feeding, breathing. They advanced through walls of smoke, faces wrapped in wet cloth, gripping hoses that spat steam before the water could touch the flames. Some thought of Europe, of the photographs from London and Warsaw, cities turned to cinders by war. But this was Cleveland, and the enemy was invisible. Captain William Shaughnessy led his men toward the gas plant's western gate. They pushed forward through waves of heat so fierce it blistered the paint on their helmets. Behind them, residents fled carrying whatever they could: blankets, radios, a handful of family photos. Fire trucks lined the streets, their bells clanging as water pressure failed. Every hydrant they opened hissed steam instead of water. The fire was burning through the city's veins, igniting gas lines that twisted beneath the pavement. In the midst of the confusion, two firefighters reached the side of tank number 2. They tried to close a main valve, hoping to cut the flow feeding the flames. One of them shouted over the noise, but his words vanished in the wind. Then the ground lifted. Tank 2 exploded with the violence of artillery. The blast hurled men backward through the air, throwing trucks into nearby yards. Windows shattered for miles. The shockwave traveled through the neighborhood like a physical scream, ripping doors from hinges and flattening fences. Firefighters were tossed against walls, their equipment scattered like toys. Some never stood up again. For those who survived the initial blast, the nightmare continued. Burning gas rolled across the ground like waves of liquid fire. Firemen crawled to safety, their coats smoldering. One man stumbled toward a hydrant only to find his hose melted to the pavement. Another clutched his helmet, dazed, his face streaked with ash and blood. They had come to fight a fire, but what they faced was something else entirely, a living storm of heat and smoke that devoured everything in its reach. Meanwhile, the residents of the east side were caught in a desperate flight. Families poured from their homes, dragging children through smoke so thick it blinded them. Some tried to save their neighbors, others simply ran until their lungs burned. From a distance, witnesses saw silhouettes of people moving through sheets of flame, their figures disappearing one by one. The noise was unbearable: sirens, explosions, the endless roar of gas escaping from ruptured lines. Cleveland's skyline glowed red as night began to fall. Firefighters, covered in soot and sweat, stood in disbelief at what they were facing. Behind them, more engines arrived, but there was nothing left to fight, only heat, smoke, and ruin. Men who had trained for years to control fire now stood powerless before its scale. They had risked everything to save a city that was already burning from within. In those moments, the line between heroism and tragedy blurred. Every firefighter, every engineer, every mother clutching a child became part of the same story. A city undone not by war, not by nature, but by its own pursuit of progress. And as the second tank's shockwave faded into silence, Cleveland realized the fight had only just begun. The fire spread faster than anyone could comprehend. Within minutes, flames raced through the network of soars beneath Cleveland's east side, igniting pockets of gas that had collected unseen. Each explosion pushed the Inferno further, turning the city's underground tunnels into blazing arteries. Manholes burst open like volcanoes, spewing fire into the streets. The ground itself seemed alive, pulsing with heat and destruction. Everywhere, chaos erupted. Houses nearest the plant collapsed first, their walls folding inward under the pressure. Roofs burst into flame, and entire blocks were swallowed by the spreading gas fire. The air shimmered with heat waves, bending light and blurring the outlines of the city. What had begun as a localized accident had now become an unstoppable chain reaction. Fire was no longer confined to the plant, it was inside the streets, beneath homes, within the very infrastructure of Cleveland. The asphalt began to soften and melt. Tires sank into the roads as cars caught fire one by one, their gas tanks exploding like gunfire. Flames climbed wooden poles, crackling through telephone wires that hissed and snapped in showers of sparks. The smell of burning tar mixed with smoke thick enough to choke anyone who lingered too long. In every direction, the sound of destruction filled the air, the roar of gas, the splintering of timber, the collapse of brick. At first, residents thought it was a bomb raid. The country was still at war, and no one could imagine that this level of devastation could come from within. Families poured out of their homes, dragging children, carrying dogs, clutching whatever belongings they could grab. The air was so hot that people covered their faces with towels and coats, running through alleys already glowing with fire. Sparks floated through the smoke like fireflies, catching on hair, clothing, and curtains. A mother stumbled through the chaos holding a baby wrapped in a blanket. Behind her, her house disintegrated in a single flash, a plume of orange and black swallowing everything she owned. Across the street, a man tried to start his car, but the ignition sparked too late. The vehicle went up in flames before he could open the door. Neighbors shouted each other's names but heard no replies. The noise was beyond human comprehension, a wall of sound made of fire and collapsing steel. Cleveland's fire brigades, already stretched to their limits, were overwhelmed. Engines lined the main roads, but the heat was unbearable. Firemen dragged hoses through ankle-deep water that boiled on contact with the ground. Hydrants hissed steam, their pressure failing under the demand. Even when water reached the flames, it evaporated instantly, turning into clouds that added to the suffocating fog. The fire seemed immune, feeding on its own destruction. By now, the smoke had turned the afternoon into night. The sun vanished behind a rolling wall of soot that reached hundreds of feet high. The only light came from the Inferno itself, an orange glow that stretched across the sky and reflected in the surface of the lake. Witnesses later said it looked like the world's edge had caught fire. Ash drifted through the air, coating everything in a layer of grey dust that sparkled with embers. Inside the city, panic deepened. Hospitals overflowed with the injured. Some arrived burned beyond recognition. Others collapsed from smoke inhalation before they could reach the doors. Nurses wrapped wounds with whatever cloth they could find. The smell of scorched flesh hung in the corridors, mixing with the metallic sting of blood. Outside, ambulances weaved through debris-strewn streets, their sirens drowned out by the unending roar of fire. Utility lines failed one by one. Electricity cut out across entire neighborhoods, plunging survivors into darkness illuminated only by fire. Gas mains ruptured beneath their homes, and water pressure dropped to a trickle. The city's lifelines, its power, its communication, its water, were all being devoured by the blaze. The flames didn't just destroy buildings, they dismantled Cleveland's ability to respond. In the distance, the sound of metal groaning filled the air. Telephone poles bent until they snapped, collapsing into the inferno with a sound like breaking bones. Iron fences twisted and curled. Storefront signs melted, their letters dripping down like wax. The fire consumed everything that had defined the neighborhood, its schools, its churches, its homes, reducing it to a blackened landscape that no one could recognize. Witnesses miles away described seeing the city's horizon flicker as though the earth itself were breathing fire. A man standing on a hill outside the blast zone later said, "The air itself was burning." That was no exaggeration. The heat was so intense that oxygen seemed to ignite mid-air. Even those who escaped felt their skin blister under the radiant heat. As night approached, Cleveland became a silhouette framed by fire. The East Side, once filled with laughter, work, and music, had become a living nightmare. The flames moved with purpose, devouring the old wooden houses, leaping from roof to roof until nothing stood unburned. Sirens wailed through the smoke, merging with the scream of metal and the relentless roar of the blaze. There was no longer order, no longer strategy, only survival. Firefighters stumbled through smoldering ruins, trying to drag survivors from doorways collapsing behind them. Every breath they took tasted of ash. Every step forward brought new danger as the ground shifted beneath them. And through it all, the fire grew, hungry and endless, swallowing a city that had built its identity on progress and pride. Cleveland's heart was burning, and no one could stop it. At exactly 3 p.m., Cleveland reached its breaking point. Tank number 2, glowing red from the heat, split apart with a sound that tore through the city like the crack of the earth itself. For a fraction of a second, everything froze, the wind stopped, the air tightened, and then the world detonated. A wall of fire erupted from the ground, shooting hundreds of feet into the sky. The explosion ripped through the main tank as though it were paper, and in an instant, the east side became a storm of light and destruction. The force hurled firefighters through the air, slamming them against brick walls and overturned trucks. Houses disintegrated in seconds, their wooden frames igniting before the debris could even hit the ground. Cars parked along the streets flipped end over end, their metal shells melting as they rolled. People who had run into the open streets for safety vanished in the blast, their shadows seared into the pavement. It was not fire as anyone understood it, it was pure energy, heat so intense it devoured everything it touched. The temperature soared to nearly 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit, hotter than molten steel. Concrete cracked like glass. Iron fences bent as though made of wax. Flames reached hundreds of feet into the air, curling in violent spirals that painted the sky in shades of orange and black. Entire blocks simply ceased to exist. The fire consumed the air itself, pulling oxygen from the streets and leaving behind a silence broken only by the moan of collapsing buildings. For those outside the immediate blast zone, the sight was beyond comprehension. From miles away, Clevelanders saw a column of flame rising above the skyline, bright enough to be seen from across Lake Erie. The explosion was so powerful that windows shattered in downtown offices several miles away. Many thought the city had been bombed. The war in Europe and the Pacific had filled the newspapers with images of devastation, and now, as people watched from their porches, they believed the enemy had arrived. But there were no planes, no sirens of warning. The destruction had come from within, born from the city's own creation. At the site of the plant, the ground had been torn open. Where the tanks once stood, a crater yawned wide enough to swallow trucks whole. Flames poured from its depths, fed by ruptured pipelines still gushing gas. The inferno roared like a living thing, breathing with every surge of escaping fuel. Steel beams twisted and curled around the edges of the crater, glowing white in the heat. The blast had vaporized nearly everything nearby, leaving behind only fragments of stone, metal, and bone. The second explosion unleashed a chain reaction across the neighborhood. Gas lines buried beneath the streets burst open one after another, releasing new torrents of fuel that ignited instantly. The fire spread in every direction, jumping from block to block, following the veins of the city. Each new burst sent waves of heat and smoke higher into the sky. The air pressure dropped, pulling wind inward toward the flames, feeding them faster. It was as though the city itself had turned into a furnace, consuming its own body to keep the fire alive. Firefighters who survived the blast regrouped on the outskirts, their faces blackened, their gear melted to their skin. They tried to hold the line, spraying water into the Inferno, but the fire repelled every effort. Streams of water hissed into clouds of steam before reaching their targets. The ground beneath them trembled with each new eruption, and debris rained from the sky, fragments of tanks, pieces of brick, shards of glass. The air shimmered like a mirage, the heat distorting everything in sight. Residents watched helplessly from a distance as the fire devoured their homes. A man who had escaped earlier stood in disbelief, clutching a charred photo frame he had found in the street. A young girl cried as she watched the schoolhouse collapse in flames, her mother too stunned to move. The church bell that once marked the hours began to toll on its own, the ropes burning away until the bell melted and fell. Everything familiar, the markets, the factories, the houses lined with maple trees, was erased in one long, unending roar. By mid-afternoon, the fire had grown into a phenomenon that no one could control. The smoke rose in thick black plumes visible from across the lake, spreading outward like storm clouds. Planes passing overhead reported that Cleveland looked like a city under siege. The fire's reflection danced on the water miles away, a constant reminder of the power raging within. The heat was so intense that telephone wires stretched until they snapped, falling like ribbons into the streets. The roads buckled, water mains burst, and sections of the city began to sink where the soil beneath had burned away. The gas continued to pour from underground reservoirs, feeding the flames hour after hour. Every attempt to cut the flow failed, every new fire line collapsed. The firefighters were reduced to containing the perimeter, trying to keep the inferno from spreading further into the heart of the city. They fought exhaustion, heat stroke, and despair, knowing that nothing could be saved within the blast zone. As evening approached, Cleveland glowed like a dying sun. The smoke blotted out the stars, turning night into an endless twilight of red and black. Flames still licked at the edges of collapsed buildings, and the heat radiating from the ground was enough to blister the skin of anyone who came too close. In some places, the fire burned underground, where gas continued to seep through cracks and tunnels, igniting in bursts that illuminated the ruins. The city that had once stood as a symbol of American progress was now a wasteland of ash and molten debris. The fire showed no mercy. It moved through the ruins with the precision of a predator, finding whatever fuel remained and devouring it. Entire families had vanished without a trace. No bodies, no remains, just absence. Streets that once echoed with laughter and work songs were silent, replaced by the low hum of destruction. For more than 10 hours, the fire fed itself on everything Cleveland had built, transforming factories, homes, and hope into smoke. When night finally deepened, the city was unrecognizable. From a distance, the horizon glowed as though the world were on fire. The lake reflected the orange blaze, and ships anchored offshore reported feeling waves of heat rolling across the water. Clevelanders who watched from the hills wept quietly, unable to look away from the horror below. They had read about bombed cities overseas, London, Dresden, Hiroshima, but never imagined their own could burn in the same light. The East Ohio gas explosion had become something more than a tragedy. It was a vision of apocalypse, a glimpse into what happens when progress forgets its limits. And as midnight approached, the flames still raged, indifferent to prayer or effort, turning Cleveland's proud industrial heart into an open wound glowing against the dark. When dawn finally broke over Cleveland, the fire had exhausted itself. The city that had burned all night now lay silent beneath a grey veil of smoke. The flames were gone, but the heat still rose from the ground in wavering sheets. Ash drifted through the air like falling snow, settling on what little remained of the east side. Where streets once wound between homes and shops, there was now only emptiness, black soil, twisted steel, and the faint hiss of steam rising from the ruins. Rescue workers arrived at first light, stepping carefully through the wreckage. The earth was still hot enough to scorch their boots. Entire blocks had vanished as though erased from existence. Brick walls stood like broken teeth, their edges glowing faintly from the heat that had devoured everything inside. The smell of burned rubber, oil, and flesh lingered in the air. Firefighters, their faces blackened and eyes red from exhaustion, searched for survivors but found only silence. The first bodies were discovered near the crater where the tanks had once stood. What remained of the East Ohio Gas Company plant was unrecognizable. Steel beams curled like ribbons, pipelines melted into puddles of metal. Investigators picked their way across the debris, marking spots with chalk where human remains were found. Many of the victims could not be identified. The fire had left behind only fragments, a ring fused to bone, a watch face warped by heat, a handful of teeth scattered in the dust. Across the city, the scope of the tragedy unfolded. 79 homes were gone, 2 factories reduced to heaps of ash, and more than 200 cars had burned where they stood. The explosion's shockwave had shattered windows across miles, and the blast crater yawned like a wound in the earth. Streets that once echoed with laughter and daily life were now quiet fields of ruin. People wandered through the ashes in disbelief, pointing to where their houses had stood, trying to recognize landmarks that no longer existed. Hospitals filled with the injured, those who had escaped the flames but not the heat. Nurses worked without rest, treating burns that covered entire bodies. Many of the survivors were unrecognizable even to their own families. Cleveland's morgues overflowed, forcing authorities to convert school gymnasiums into temporary identification centers. Relatives waited in long, silent lines, clutching photographs and scraps of jewelry, hoping for confirmation or closure. For some, neither came. The funerals began within days. Coffins draped in black lined the steps of churches, and bells tolled through the city's haze. Flags flew at half-mast as processions of fire trucks escorted the fallen firefighters to their final rest. Crowds gathered in the streets, their faces pale, their expressions hollow. Newspapers called it the city that burned itself. The phrase spread across headlines nationwide, turning Cleveland's tragedy into a symbol of industrial hubris. What had been the pride of modern energy had become a graveyard of innovation. Investigators worked quickly, determined to understand what had gone wrong. Metallurgists examined the fragments of tank number 4 and found the truth buried in the seams. The steel had failed. The welds, thought to be strong enough to contain liquefied gas at extreme temperatures, had cracked under stress. The design itself was flawed, too experimental, too untested. The engineers who once celebrated its brilliance now faced the unbearable truth that their creation had betrayed them. The official report called it a catastrophic failure of containment. But for Clevelanders, it was something deeper, a betrayal of faith in progress. The plant had been built to serve the war effort, to power homes and factories, to light the path toward victory. Instead, it had destroyed part of the very city it was meant to sustain. What was meant to fuel a nation's triumph had turned into a lesson written in fire. Rebuilding began almost immediately, though no one could agree on how to start. The government promised assistance, and the East Ohio Gas Company pledged to compensate the victims, but no amount of money could repair what had been lost. The survivors returned to find neighborhoods erased from the map, entire generations wiped out. Children were orphaned, families scattered, memories reduced to photographs salvaged from debris. As the weeks passed, the city's skyline changed. New buildings rose where the ruins had been cleared, but the scars remained. Those who had lived through the disaster spoke of nightmares, the sound of explosions echoing in their sleep, the smell of gas haunting their kitchens. Some refused to move back, unable to bear the weight of the past. Others stayed, determined to rebuild what the fire had taken, though the shadow of the Inferno lingered in every street. In the end, the East Ohio gas disaster reshaped more than Cleveland's skyline. It reshaped the nation's understanding of safety. Regulations changed, laws were rewritten, and above-ground storage of liquefied natural gas was outlawed. Future tanks would be buried deep beneath the earth, far from homes and schools. The lessons carved into Cleveland's ashes spread across the world, guiding engineers and lawmakers alike. But for the people who lived through it, those lessons came too late. They had seen progress turn to ruin, science twist into tragedy. The morning after the fire, as smoke drifted over the silent ruins, one headline captured the city's grief better than any report or speech. Cleveland's brightest future burned in its own flame. In the years that followed, Cleveland rose again from the ashes, but it was never quite the same city. The East Ohio Gas Company rebuilt its facilities quietly, avoiding the attention that once surrounded its technological triumph. New tanks were buried underground, hidden from sight, as if concealing the memory of what had happened. The neighborhood that had been obliterated was slowly reconstructed. Rows of new homes, paved roads, trimmed lawns, but the ghosts of that October day lingered in the air. For the survivors, progress was no longer a promise. It was a wound that never fully healed. They said the smell of gas never truly left. On humid afternoons, when the wind blew from the lake, a faint sweetness drifted through the streets, subtle but unmistakable. Those who lived through the Inferno would pause, look up from their work, and feel their stomachs tighten. For them, that scent wasn't just a reminder of fire, it was the smell of everything they had lost: families, homes, and the illusion that human progress was invincible. In the aftermath, engineers and investigators worked tirelessly to ensure such a disaster could never happen again. Out of Cleveland's ruins came a revolution in industrial safety. The federal government introduced new standards for gas storage, insisting that all large quantities of liquefied natural gas be kept underground. The once celebrated idea of towering metal tanks gleaming in city skylines was abandoned forever. Across America, companies redesigned their plants, fearing that what had happened in Ohio could happen anywhere. Yet beneath those reforms lay a deeper, uncomfortable question, one that still haunts historians and engineers alike: who was truly to blame? Some pointed to the East Ohio Gas Company itself, accusing its executives of prioritizing production over caution. They had rushed to expand their storage capacity to meet wartime demand, cutting corners in materials and oversight. Others blamed the engineers, the men who had built the tanks and guaranteed their safety. They had believed too much in the infallibility of their designs, too confident that mathematics could outsmart nature. But a few saw the fault on a grander scale. They blamed a nation at war, a government obsessed with output, and an industrial culture that prized speed above safety. In 1944, America was producing more steel, gas, and ammunition than any country in history. Every city was an engine of war, every factory a battlefield. There was no time for hesitation. In that sense, Cleveland was not a single failure. It was a symptom of an age driven by urgency and faith in machinery. The lawsuits that followed dragged on for years. The company paid settlements to the victims' families, yet no one went to prison, and no executive's career truly ended. The disaster faded from the headlines as quickly as it had erupted. Within a decade, Cleveland's economy was booming again. New factories stood where the fire had once raged. Children played in parks built over the old streets. A monument was proposed, then quietly forgotten. Progress demanded silence. By the 1950s, the East Side had been transformed. Streets once coated in ash now gleamed with new asphalt. Streetlights illuminated the same corners where fire had once poured from the ground. The crater was filled and flattened, and traffic rolled smoothly over it as if nothing had ever happened. People moved on, or at least they tried to. But history has a way of whispering through what we build. Beneath the foundations of those houses, under every inch of concrete, lay a story the city never truly buried. Decades passed. The world changed, wars ended, industries evolved, the skyline grew higher, but the memory of the Cleveland Inferno lived quietly among those who knew where to look. Local historians kept the records alive. Firefighters passed the story to their recruits. And every few years, a newspaper would publish a retrospective piece, reminding readers that the worst disaster in Cleveland's history hadn't come from an enemy abroad, but from the heart of its own ambition. Today, if you walk along East 61st Street, there is no visible trace of the tragedy. The modern buildings stand tall, unassuming, their walls painted in calm shades of beige and blue. Cars hum down the roads that were once split open by fire. Life goes on, indifferent yet unknowingly built upon the ashes of 1944. Still, some locals say that on certain afternoons, when the wind changes and the air grows still, a faint scent returns, a whisper of gas mixed with the smell of wet concrete and rust. They say it isn't danger that rises from the ground, but memory. It's as if the earth itself remembers what humans tried to forget. The sound of explosions, the burning sky, the cries that filled the streets, all of it trapped beneath the soil, waiting to be acknowledged. 80 years later, the Cleveland Inferno remains a silent lesson. It speaks not through headlines or monuments, but through the very air above the city. It reminds us that progress, when unchecked, can become its own destruction. The East Ohio Gas Company rebuilt, the city recovered, and the world moved forward, But somewhere, deep in the foundations of Cleveland, the fire still breathes, quiet and unseen, a warning carried on the wind.